The morning started like any other episode of Today with Jenna and Friends. With the familiar buzz of the audience and Jenna's upbeat tone setting the stage, Blake Shelton, a country superstar known for his easygoing charm, had been invited as the day's special guest to discuss his latest album and upcoming tour. At first, the conversation was lighthearted, filled with jokes about life on the road and playful banter about his time on The Voice. But as the interview progressed, Jenna shifted the discussion to more personal territory, asking about some recent public controversies involving Blake's comments on social media. Blake's smile tightened, and although he tried to deflect with humor, Jenna pressed further, quoting his exact words and asking whether he stood by them. The shift in tone was noticeable, and the audience's laughter grew quieter. Blake took a sip of his coffee, his eyes narrowing slightly as if calculating his next move. It was clear that he hadn't expected the conversation to take such a turn, and his usual laid-back manner began to harden into something more defensive. Jenna, sensing the tension, didn't back down. She followed up with a pointed question about whether celebrities like Blake should be more mindful of the influence they have over their fans, particularly younger audiences. Blake leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and replied that he wasn't in the business of babysitting anyone's moral compass, emphasized that he was a musician, not a role model, and people should take his words with a grain of salt. They deserved. The audience reacted with a mixture of murmurs and scattered applause, unsure whether to side with Jenna's challenge or Blake's unapologetic stance. Jenna, maintaining her composure, reminded him that whether he liked it or not, millions looked up to him, and that public figures carry a certain responsibility. Blake chuckled, though there was no warmth in it, and remarked that responsibility was a word people used when they wanted to control someone else's behavior. The exchange was still civil on the surface, but underneath it was clear that both were digging their heels in, neither willing to concede an inch. The atmosphere in the studio was shifting. Jenna's co-host tried to lighten the mood by steering the conversation back to Blake's music, but the tension was already lodged firmly in the air. Jenna pivoted again, asking if his recent comments were a reflection of deeper frustrations with the music industry or just an offhand remark. Blake's tone grew sharper as he accused the media of constantly twisting his words to fit a narrative. He claimed that interviews often took things out of context, creating drama where there was none. Jenna, however, countered with specific headlines and interviews from the past few weeks, pointing out that the words in question had been aired live, without editing. Blake's jaw clenched, and he shot back that people love outrage more than they love the truth. The back and forth was becoming more than just an interview. It felt like a debate, and the studio audience was caught in the crossfire, sensing they were witnessing a moment that might soon make headlines. Blake's frustration became more visible with every passing minute. His posture stiffened, and his normally relaxed southern drawl took on an edge. Jenna, perhaps realizing she had struck a nerve, asked if his recent online spats with other artists were also being misinterpreted. Blake's response was quick. In cutting, he said that unlike many in the industry, he wasn't afraid to speak his mind and didn't need PR teams crafting every sentence for him. He accused some fellow musicians of being plastic, presenting a perfect image while hiding behind carefully curated statements. While Jenna raised an eyebrow and noted that such comments could be perceived as hypocritical given his own public persona. The tension between them was palpable, and for the first time, Blake seemed to lose some of his practiced cool. He leaned forward, almost challenging Jenna, and asked if she was accusing him of being fake. The audience collectively held their breath, sensing the stakes had just been raised. The exchange took on a more personal tone. Jenna stated that as a host, her job was to ask the questions that viewers wanted answered, even if they were uncomfortable. Blake fired back that there was a difference between asking hard questions and pushing a personal agenda. Jenna denied having any agenda, insisting that her line of questioning was based on public interest and recent events. Blake shook his head, saying that public interest was just a fancy term for gossip. The remark drew a few gasps from the audience, as it was clear he was lumping Jenna's work into that category. Jenna's smile grew tighter, but she didn't back down. Instead, she asked whether he truly believed criticism was always malicious, or if it could be constructive. Blake hesitated before replying that constructive criticism didn't usually come from people looking for sound bites. The tension in the room was now thick enough to feel, and the chemistry between guest and host had shifted from cordial to combative. Trying to regain control of the moment, Jenna attempted to soften the conversation by acknowledging Blake's success and contributions to country music, but the compliment came with a caveat. She suggested that with influence comes a responsibility to set a better example. Blake exhaled sharply and said that was exactly the kind of moral policing he had a problem with. He argued that people should be free to speak their minds without worrying about how every word would be scrutinized or weaponized. Jenna pointed out that freedom of speech didn't mean freedom from consequences. The audience reacted audibly, some clapping in support of Jenna's point, while others murmured their agreement with Blake. The divide in the room mirrored the divide at the table, and both sides seemed equally determined to stand their ground. It was no longer an interview wit. It was a philosophical clash playing out in real time. At this point, Blake's irritation was undeniable. He shifted in his seat, glanced at his watch, and made a comment about how he hadn't expected to spend his morning defending himself on live television. Jenna quipped that sometimes the most interesting conversations are the unplanned ones, but her tone carried an edge. Blake responded that interesting didn't always mean productive, and he was starting to wonder if this one was worth continuing. The comment hung in the air for a moment before Jenna, with a touch of sarcasm, asked if he wanted to end the interview early. Blake smiled thinly and said he'd consider it if things kept going the way they were. The audience laughed nervously, unsure if he was joking. The uneasy humor did nothing to diffuse the tension, it only underscored how close they were to a breaking point. Jenna, perhaps sensing that Blake might actually walk out, tried to steer the conversation toward lighter topics, but Blake wasn't in the mood to pivot. When she brought up his relationship with fellow country star Gwen Stefani, he bristled, saying that his personal life was off limits in this conversation. Jenna reminded him that he had often spoken about Gwen in past interviews, to which Blake replied that those were on his terms, it's not someone else's. His tone was sharp enough that a few audience members audibly reacted. Jenna, undeterred, asked one more question about how the two supported each other through public scrutiny. Blake responded curtly that he didn't need to explain his private life to anyone, certainly not in the middle of what felt like an ambush. The tension reached a new high, and it was becoming clear that the interview was spiraling beyond recovery. The moment of no return arrived when Jenna, in a last attempt to get a direct answer, asked whether Blake regretted any of his recent comments or would double down on them. Blake leaned forward, locked eyes with her, and said that regret was for people who didn't mean what they said. He added that he stood by every word, even if it made some people uncomfortable. Jenna replied that perhaps making people uncomfortable wasn't always a badge of honor, especially if it hurt those who supported him. Blake's expression hardened, and he muttered that this conversation was over. He pushed back his chair, the scraping sound cutting through the stunned silence of the studio. Jenna attempted to respond, but Blake had already stood up, adjusting his jacket and making his way toward the edge of the stage. The cameras followed every step, capturing the shocked faces of the audience and Jenna's own look of disbelief. As Blake reached the backstage area, few crew members tried to convince him to return, but his mind was made up. He waved them off, muttering something under his breath that the microphones didn't catch. Jenna, back at the desk, addressed the audience directly, acknowledging that live TV can bring unexpected moments and that today was one of them. She thanked the viewers for staying with them and promised to move on to the next segment. Social media lit up almost instantly, with clips of Blake's abrupt exit spreading across platforms within minutes. Some viewers criticized Jenna for pushing too hard, while others applauded her for holding him accountable. Meanwhile, Blake's fans defended him fiercely, arguing that he had every right to walk out if he felt disrespected. By the end of the day, the clash had become a trending topic, and both Blake and Jenna were at the center of a national conversation about celebrity accountability, freedom of speech, and the unpredictable nature of live television.